I'm going to step off the limb. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
When you think about the Apollo era of spaceflight, what's the first thing that comes to mind? My guess is Apollo 11, the mission where humans, for the very first time, landed upon an extraterrestrial world, the moon. However, there's a lot that isn't said or remembered about the endeavors of our past. Most people don't know the challenges and controversies faced before NASA's success. No, this story isn't about the glories of Apollo 11. This story is about one space mission in particular that stands out the least, yet reveals the most. A mission shrouded by death, distrust, and the illusion of perfection. This mission is known as Apollo 7. I'm your host, Matthew Goryczkowski, and you're listening to Apollo 7, The Forgotten Mission. The Apollo 7 crew composed of 3 astronauts, Wally Schirra, Walter Cunningham, and Don Isley. 3 astronauts who stepped up to the plate as hope was dwindling for NASA in the midst of the Cold War. But before we dive into the controversial history of Apollo 7, it's important to understand where its legacy began.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Horrified engineers watched the burst of flames and smoke envelop Grissom, White, and Chaffee. They heard their last words of shock and surprise. It was over in an unbelievable microsecond. The flames enveloped Apollo 1, burning the couches, charring the spacesuits. The crewmen never had a chance.
In the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy set a precedent not only for the United States of America, but for the world. Apollo 1 was supposed to be the beginning of a new age in spaceflight. However, on January 27, 1967, hope of ever landing on the moon began to fade. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were no more.
Right as they're about to launch the very first Apollo mission to get ready to go to the moon, there's a tragedy.
That's Francis French, a space historian and author who I interviewed at the San Diego Air and Space Museum as he stood in front of the glorious Apollo 9 spacecraft, surrounded by some of the world's most influential aerial innovation.
Fortunately and unfortunately, it was on the ground. When a tragedy happens on the ground, the investigators can get inside the spacecraft, they can work out what happened. If the tragedy had been in space, they may never have known what happened. It was a huge blow for NASA. NASA were very confident about their Apollo spacecraft, and before a crew had even launched, 3 people had died. The trouble was that the spacecraft was pressured with pure oxygen. Pure oxygen is a lot easier to use when you're in space because it's a lot simpler. The trouble is when it's on the ground at high pressure, it's essentially a really good catalyst for a fire. So if you've got a tiny electrical spark or if you've got materials that can catch fire easily, they will go up in flames very, very quickly. And that's what happened inside that Apollo 1 spacecraft. It was pressurized for sea level, which it never would have been in space. Probably they think an electrical spark was enough to ignite a fire inside, and the 3 guys inside died within seconds.
It was a spectacularly tiny cone-shaped spacecraft that barely crammed 3 people inside, with about as much room as the back seats of a Toyota Sienna. With the incredibly challenging task of opening the hatch, the astronauts were stuck as flames burst inside their 100% oxygenated space capsule. There was no chance of escape. It is a well-known fact that oxygen is flammable, so shouldn't it have been obvious to the smartest scientists and engineers in the world that filling a tiny room with 100% oxygen could be dangerous? In an interview with Roy Neal in 1998 for NASA's Oral History program, Wally Schirra, an American naval aviator chosen as one of the original 7 astronauts and the commander of Apollo 7, spoke heavily about his views of what happened to Apollo 1.
I was annoyed at the way what became Apollo 1 came out of the plant at Downey. It was not finished. It was what they call a lot of uncompleted work or incomplete tests and work done on it. So it was shipped to the Cape with a bunch of spare parts and things to finish it out. And that, of course, caused this whole atmosphere of developing where I would almost call it a first case of bad go fever. Go fever meaning we've got to keep going, got to keep going, got to keep going. When my crew did the test that was followed by Gus and his guys, we were in a sea level atmosphere, no pure oxygen. We were in shirt sleeves. And there were things going on I didn't like at all. I was no longer annoyed. I was really pretty goddamn mad. There were glitches, electronic things that just didn't come out right. That evening, I debriefed with Joe Shea and Gus. I said, if there are any things that go wrong, like a glitch in the electronic circuit, some bad sounds, scrub. Because Gus and his guys were going to do it in pure oxygen in an environment that's not very forgiving. We didn't realize how unforgiving it was at that point. We'd gone through the same environment with Mercury and Gemini and made it through. Not that I think of it in that way, but that's how I look at it in retrospect. Gus, I can recall saying, if I can't talk to the blockhouse, how the hell are we going to go to the moon with this damn thing?
Do you remember what your reaction was to the Apollo 1 fire?
We all felt bad because we lost friends. We lost prime crew. And we also wondered if they would keep operating the Apollo program on it.
That's Walter Cunningham, Apollo 7 lunar module pilot, and ultimately one of the last Apollo astronauts alive today. NASA needed to figure out what happened to Apollo 1 as fast as possible if they were ever going to make it to the moon before the Soviet Union. At about 4 in the afternoon, before the fire, Wally, Walt, and Don decided to fly back to their homes in Texas, since NASA was only conducting a ground test that day.
We decided that we would say bye-bye, and they'd get home probably the next day. And by the time we landed and pulled into the chocks there at Ellington Field, the Vice Department head was out there meeting us. So the alarm immediately went up with us that there's something wrong. We had never dreamed it would have been a fire on the pad. But it turns out that they had died in that fire. And so we ended up going to work on the investigation board for several months.
During my interview with Walter Cunningham, he mentioned his fellow crew member, United States Air Force officer and Apollo 7 command module pilot, Don Isley, had deeply personal views of the Apollo 1 fire. So I did some digging and found a biography called Apollo Pilot, the Memoir of Astronaut Don Isley, which happened to be edited by none other than Francis French, where Don reflects heavily on this tragedy.
Walt and I got involved with the post-fire investigation. Wally copped out, in retrospect a wise move. The first thing we had to do was listen to voice tapes and try to identify who said what in the spacecraft when the fire broke out. Did you ever listen to your friends scream in panic, then agony, as they fry to death? Listen to it over and over again? I don't know why we did it. I guess it seemed terribly important at the time to find out who said what. Then I spent some time in the spacecraft cabin, or what was left of it, trying to help the fire experts identify bits and pieces of charred and melted material. The acrid smell of burnt plastic, paint, and nylon was overpowering. There were little pieces of debris all over the floor and the crew couches. The sidewalls and the instrument panels were charred, discolored, and warped from the heat. The mess in the cabin and the screaming on the voice tapes gave me nightmares at first, but after a while the dreams went away, along with the knot in my stomach. The real tragedy of the fire was that it was so preventable, so unnecessary, almost criminal, in fact. The incredibly incompetent management which, in my opinion, led to the fire arose out of George Mueller's naive stupidity and Joe Shea's colossal ego. Mueller was manned spaceflight chief at NASA headquarters, and Shea was Apollo manager at NASA in Houston. Mueller would dictate some impossible schedules for spacecraft delivery, checkout, and launch. Shea was vain enough to think he could meet them. And the contractors were dishonest or equally stupid, or both, for not telling NASA that they couldn't hack it. 2 years before the fire, a number of astronauts and engineers petitioned Shea to approve a simple, one-piece, outward-opening hatch design in place of the awkward two-piece hatch panel we had back then. Not only was it cumbersome to handle, it sealed from inside the cabin, which meant that any slight overpressure in the cabin, like in a fire, would plaster it against its seals so hard that you couldn't pull it loose with elephants. Shea turned us down. Too much money and not enough time, he said. It's a crew comfort item. You guys are just too lazy to wrestle with the hatch we've got. What the hell? It works, doesn't it? He said to me, Don, you just worry about getting ready to fly, and let us worry about spacecraft design. We'll take care of you, don't worry. And he took care of us all right. Just ask Gus, Roger, and Ed of the Apollo 1 crew. Oops, sorry, they're not around anymore. Sorry about the test, fellows, but we'd gotta go to meet the launch schedule. I remember looking at Ed White's finger scrapings and the melted goo on the inner hatch surface. He must have pawed frantically trying to get the hatch open. just seconds before he expired from searing hot gases that suffocated him and burned out his lungs.
A huge thank you to our interviewees, Walter Cunningham, Francis French, and our Don Isley narrator, David Kaufman. This podcast is produced and edited by me, Matthew Gorichkovsky. Original music composed by Jamie Bangan. Our sound recordists are Christian Black, Philip Long, Nancy Wynn, and Matthew Crouchley. Our co-sound mixer is Daniel Mammon. Special thank you to University of California Irvine's digital filmmaking faculty, Ulysses Jenkins, Brian Jackson, and Bruce Yanamoto, and to my friends and family, Nick Levy, David Toledo, Enrique Aceves, Gabriel Campos, Cameron Baluch, Sam Verdernikov, Yefim Verdernikov, Aaron Gorichkovsky, and Nadia Malamud. This production was made in collaboration with the University of California Irvine Digital Filmmaking Program. Excerpts were taken from the autobiography Apollo Pilot, the memoir of astronaut Don Isley, edited by Francis French, and can be bought on Amazon for those that are interested. The 1998 interview done with Wally Schirra was conducted by NASA's Oral History Program at the NASA Johnson Space Center. In addition, we will be uploading all full-length interviews to our YouTube channel, Apollo 7 The Forgotten Mission, made possible by our cinematographer Corey Wynn and camera operators Philip Long and Christian Black. Check it out if you're interested in listening to the complete interviews. As a reminder, all episodes are currently published and available for you to enjoy. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.